Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Victoria with AWSinsider.net, and I am so thrilled to be welcoming you to today's webcast titled Finally, Fix What Your CNAPP Found, sponsored by Sunrise Security. Before we begin, just want to cover a few housekeeping details for today. We will be having a Q&A session at the end of today's event, so if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please make sure to type those into the Q&A box and we'll have them answered by our experts. Sunrise has also provided some resources which do correspond with today's event, so please take a moment to check those out. Those are going to be located to the right-hand side of your audience console. And as a reminder, today's webcast is being recorded, so please make sure you keep an eye out for a link in your email to rewatch the presentation or to share it with a colleague. And now I am so thrilled to introduce our speakers for today. We have the pleasure of hearing from Stephen Smiley, AWS architect, and Jeff Moncrief, field CTO at Sunrise Security. So we're in for a really great event today. And with that, I will pass the time over to Stephen and Jeff to get us started.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for having us today.
Yep. Stephen, you want to go first and do a quick little intro?
Sure. Hey, my name is Stephen Smiley. I'm a cloud security architect. I work with ScaleSec. We're a small cloud security consulting firm. And so we try to help organizations do all sorts of things with their security, right? Setting up their identity architectures and laying secure foundations for development, getting ready for migrations, kind of you name it, we're doing it in cloud security. And so I've seen a lot of different organizations, and I've seen identity and CNAPPs done a lot of different ways. And I'd love to share some of those lessons that we've seen from the people doing it well, the people doing it not so well, what we've seen in the different areas. So I'm excited to talk about it today. Jeff, why don't you go ahead?
Absolutely, thank you. Jeff Moncrief, I am the field CTO here at Sunrise Security. I've been at Sunrise now going on my 5th year. And here at Sunrise, we are focused on nothing but IAM and access fabric risk and securing that risk fabric. And so kind of like Stephen, I've been through the school of hard knocks over the years with what works, what doesn't work, folks at different levels of maturity in their public cloud security journey. But one thing that I have been championing and evangelizing over the years is that identity is not a security component that is a nice to have in your strategy. It's required. A lot of folks say that identity is the new perimeter. I've been saying for years, identity is the new network. I'm really pushing it and challenging that story in a cloud native world. And we definitely learned a lot from, the evolution of CSPMs into CNAPPs all the way to what we do today here at Sunrise. So I'm really, really looking forward to kind of telling you kind of the evolution of securing the identity fabric that we've seen here.
Awesome. So, Jeff, will you take us through some of the history of CNAPPs? What does it look like over the last few years? What have we been able to accomplish? What kind of challenges have we had?
Yeah, I mean, even prior to CNAPP, so before I came over here, I was over at Cisco Security, where I led a team of engineers, and we were focused on securing public cloud workloads with Cisco's only security tool at the time for the public cloud, which was focused on NetFlow analytics or network service group analytics in the public cloud. So flow analytics, right? Looking for things like behavioral anomaly detection, things like that, which was great. But we would talk to customers back then that were, asking us about CSPM, right? And so even dating back 6-7 years ago, CSPM kind of gave birth to this entire market of public cloud security tools, Stephen. And that was really focused back then on identify misconfigurations in the cloud, right? That's really what we need to do if we want to be securing our public cloud workloads. Our S3 buckets not encrypted, those kinds of things, right? And then we would roll those up into PCI reports, CIS benchmark reports, those kinds of things, and we give them to the executive leadership, right?
Sure.
And then that kind of evolved into, well, what about the workloads themselves, which gave birth to workload protection, right? And that's where we were doing things like actually looking for CVEs and vulnerabilities on workloads. And the market said, well, if we're doing that, then we're doing a good job at securing our public cloud environment too. Well, and then CNAPP kind of evolved. And CNAPP is really the combination of the worlds of workload protection and CSPM. And over time, identity became kind of a component in CSPMs and in CNAPPs, because securing the access fabric across the identity plane, folks, thankfully, over the last couple of years have realized that it is not a nice to have, it is a need to have. And that's because the statistics don't lie. The list of data breaches don't lie that are in multiple databases. The vast majority of security incidents in the public cloud are because of compromised credentials, whether that's a GitHub exposure, something like social engineering. But identity is the way that the adversaries just get straight into the center of our cloud. It's not by crafting bespoke exploits to 0 days. So that's given us the rise of the CNAPP market, which is kind of all encompassing, but it's a very visibility driven solution, which is what we're going to be talking about in today's session. It's very, very visibility focused.
Yeah, you described that transition from kind of network to CSPM, and I remember the optimism that we had that was like, okay, we're going to kind of move to understanding that the cloud is a bunch of resources and it's not just traffic on a network. But the findings we got out of those CSPM tools weren't nearly as helpful as we thought they would be, right? Like, we got a lot of alerts, but we didn't really know how to fix them, at least not without breaking people's workloads. And I remember, like, we would kind of go in and look for the highest priority things, and we kind of really struggled to figure out what were they, especially in like a data driven way, like understanding, do I focus on CVEs on an endpoint or identity, or like how do I keep this under control? So this evolution has gone through those same challenges.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, it's basically CSPM tools themselves and CNAPP tools. They do have a really good capability, I'd say, as it relates to doubling down on infrastructure as code and vulnerability scanning in those, right? As we kind of shift our security strategy to the left, I would say they also do a really good job at reporting on vulnerabilities and sometimes doing real-time blocking and tackling on the workloads themselves, whether that's through snapshot scanning, out-of-band, or through real-time agents on the workloads. But when it comes to platform configurations, which have now expanded into identity misconfigurations and identity excessive permissions, that's where the tools really still just give you a big list of problems that you then have to go fix, right? Yeah. So it's still a very manual effort. Even if you have a tool like that, it's still a very manual effort to actually get outcomes from it from a risk reduction standpoint.
Yeah. And it feels like at the core of all of those findings, there's some identity that's linking all of those things together, right? One of the sayings that I like to think about is that attackers are thinking in graphs and us defenders are tending to think in checklists, right? And the attackers are seeing this graph of going from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next. And at the center of that whole line is not a network path, right? But an identity path of permissions and, assumptions and so forth through there.
Yeah, you nailed it. You've got to think of the access fabric as if it were, a network. And the truth is, nothing that you deploy in the public cloud, no service, no region, no identity, no microservice, no workload, can function properly and interact with another component of the public cloud without the identity fabric. And people don't realize that. They don't realize that it is the foundation for everything that happens in a cloud native perspective. You might have your VPCs and your workloads and those kinds of things in a network group. That's amazing from an infrastructure standpoint. But when it's cloud native, it's on the platform and everything is predicated on the identity fabric. So a lot of what you see in your CNAPP or your CSPM is indeed going to be, when you're looking for root cause versus just looking at a bunch of symptoms, the root cause is very often sitting right there in the identity fabric itself.
So how did we get to the point where we kind of lost we couldn't manage all of our different identities. Like, how do
Yeah,
we
that
get
gets us.
there?
That kind of gets us to this next slide. So I just move the slide forward. Yeah, so I think a big part of the problem is it's all about cloud security maturity. Not just cloud security, now that I think, but it's just your entire cloud architecture maturity. A lot of folks, Stephen, when they start building out public cloud workloads, they just start creating user accounts in IAM directly. They're not even working with things like SSO or federated single sign-on, those kinds of things. They just start creating user accounts. Well, how do we best organize those? Through groups and roles, right? That's a very traditional RBAC kind of a mindset. And then, well, okay, well, if we're going to be using roles so we can come in as soon to go do different things, then, every single team is going to be creating roles for every one of their applications. And many times, every time they push out a new commit through the pipeline, through that DevOps pipeline, it's going to be creating more roles. And then we've got issues like turnover and attrition, and then folks moving on, where all that stuff that they put out there is now an artifact, right? I call it cyber litter and cyber garbage. And that's where I know, but it kind of is. It's this junk that's out there that exists, and we don't know why. We don't know who put it there, and we don't know if it's used, or if we're going to break something, if we were to possibly remove it. And then you also combine the fact that machine identities have exploded. And a lot of folks don't realize that machine and non-human identities often outnumber person identities in the public cloud 10 to 1. And that's what we see every day. And people don't realize, well, I've got an EC2 instance out there doing some things. Well, what you don't realize is that EC2 instance can't function without an instance profile attached to it. And that instance profile is an identity.
Yeah, and especially the more kind of cloud native you go, right? So if I want my serverless compute, like my AWS Lambda function, to do anything in the cloud, it's going to have a role attached with permissions, right?
100%.
So one of the challenges we've had is saying, well, how do I lock down the ability for somebody to create these permissions, but without blocking them from doing their job? Because they have to, right?
Yeah.
And they don't necessarily know at the outset what those required permissions are going to be. So it's not like they can put in a change request and say, okay, hey, I need to have these specific permissions, right? Like they're going to figure that out during their development process.
Well, what I've seen is most folks just end up, especially in larger development organizations, they just end up giving folks admin or star access to that particular service. And they just over provision them because they don't have the time to figure out in the development process or in the beginning what true least privileged permissions they actually need. And it starts to open the door for the mess, right?
I mean, I got to admit, I've been there myself, right? I'm trying to start with least privilege. The thing's not working. So I grant it star just so I can see if it works,
Yeah.
But I tell myself I'm going to come back and fix it. Right?
You don't. And here's why.
Or at least, I mean, I'm gonna say, at least in the public record here, I do. But I don't know if we can make that a broad rule that everybody does, right? So as you said, we come back to this litter that's just left.
It is a litter, and it leads us. Well, and here's why. We're going to show you to talk about this. It's very manual. It's very time consuming. It's static. It's inflexible, which has given birth to some cool solutions that we're going to talk about today. But right now, the status quo with the CSPM, CNAPP, or even native tooling is you've got to go fix this mess by hand. You've got to go write, hundreds, if not thousands, of least privilege policies. Here's the JSON. Good luck. Okay, go put this on as an inline policy yourself, or push it out through the pipeline. And it's static. When you need a change, you're going to have to go update that the same way. But it kind of gives us, birth to this landscape here that is kind of frightening, right? There are thousands and thousands and thousands of permissions that you have to worry about across all the cloud service providers, okay? But the vast majority of the things that are out there are not used, okay? And then we're talking about two kinds of unused, well, more than two kinds really, but unused permissions on identities that are active, and then just unused identities in themselves. right? It is a very, very manual process to have to go fix this mess at scale. This is what we have seen here at Sunry for years with customers. We've done an incredible job over the years of showing you've got a big identity problem. You can't stick your head in the sand anymore. We've opened the door. Now you can't shut it. But what are you going to do to actually fix it at the end of the day? I think that's where our challenges come into play.
Yeah, one of the challenges here is that, as you said, there's 14,000 unique permissions. That's just in AWS alone, right? And
yeah, there's over 50,000 in all of the cloud service providers combined. Yeah.
Yeah, and unfortunately, they don't map one-to-one with APIs, right? Like if I want to get an object from S3, there's not necessarily one permission that I need that's just get object, right? I also need the ability to head the object just to see its metadata, for example, right?
Yep.
And that's its own permission. And so I'm not going to completely throw the cloud providers under the bus, but they haven't given us the best, chance for success at doing this in a lot of cases.
They haven't. And, I would say that, they do a good job, okay job, good job. Some better than others with visibility, meaning these are your problems. You need to go fix them, right? But as far as the magic fix it button, the magic remediate button, right there in the cloud provider console, that's where the story starts to fall apart. And I love AWS. We are all in an AWS here at Sunry. At Sunry, we are cloud native, built from the ground up on AWS. But I just got off of a demo where I was showing, the prospect AWS IAM Access Analyzer. And I was showing them, here it is. Here are your findings. It's just like your CNAPP or your CSPM. And look what it's showing you to go do. Delete this, push this policy out. Delete this, push this policy out. But there's no button to actually go do it. Mm-hmm. It's just a bunch of things that you have to go do by hand. And so that's what gets us kind of in this state of it's a mess that's almost too big to tackle by hand, with kind of that mindset of we have to fix this mess by hand.
Sure. I mean, and that's just even thinking about one cloud. I mean, I regularly work in multiple clouds, and almost all of my customers do, right? Like they've got at least two, and
yep,
they need to tackle this in all those different platforms. So where do we start? Like if I'm trying to solve this problem and I'm not just going to dwell on it, like where do I go first?
Yeah. And I don't want folks to think that we're all doom and gloom here. Okay. So it is a problem. We want to make sure that that's well established, but that's not what the entire content of this session is, right? There is a way to get you to the promised land, I promise you. What we've seen though, it's super interesting because it doesn't matter really what your CNAPP tool of choice is, or your your CSPM, or even your cloud infrastructure entitlement management tool, which is where Sunry's played for years, showing you these crazy situations. Stephen, you'll see these lateral movement chains. And some tools call them attack paths or whatever, but they're not network based, but they look like a traditional network attack. And it's really the full kill chain showing you how it can be exploited, all the way from infiltration, all the way to, lateral movement, priv escalation to data exfiltration, right? But what we've learned over the years is that the vast majority of the hops on those issues that your CNAPP is reporting are unused identities. Trust relationships, internal trust relationships, third-party trust relationships, cross-account trust, you name it. These scenarios that create these insane lateral movement scenarios that an adversary can exploit in a matter of seconds by hand, and it's all not needed. And what you're getting in your CNAPP is a big report of a bunch of problems and really the symptom, right? But you're not getting to the root cause and fixing that. And that's really, really where people need to start. And that's the unused identities. When you take care of those unused identities, I promise you, it is fascinating to see how those identity chains crumble and how those risk indexes go from red on that little tachometer over to yellow and green, because you're actually able to remove so much risk by removing the unused garbage that's out there.
Yeah. So, so is it that simple? Can I just go and delete all of these unused identities if I get a list of them?
No, it is not that simple. And here, actually, we'll go to this slide right here. If you were to try to delete one role safely, it is a daunting task. Okay, so we plugged into a financial services organization that many folks have heard of. We plugged into their environment several weeks ago with what we call our cloud permissions firewall, which is designed to do this all automated for you. And we found, get this, 850 AWS accounts, okay? 49,000 unused identities.
Wow.
Think about that. 49,000. Now, this organization knew they had a problem. That's why they're talking to us, because they know that we can fix it, right? But that is not that atypical based on the number of accounts versus what we typically see with unused identities. And then, okay, what are you going to go do for those 49,000? Are you going to go research every one of them? And I think that this is really what I've learned over the years here is that folks are scared to death to delete this stuff. And rightfully so. There's this paralyzation that comes across folks when they don't know who put that role there. They don't know why it was there, and they don't know if it's going to be needed tomorrow or 9 months from now.
Yeah, because I know in many of my situations, I expect that to be there when I need it, right? And it's going to sit dormant for the most part, but it might be there for a break glass emergency, elevation, or it runs as a scheduled job, on some regular schedule, right? And so it's going to need to be there when my job runs. So you can't just delete it because it hasn't run for 90 days.
You cannot just delete it. And so what most folks do, most organizations, they just let it sit. They let it sit, turned on and enabled because they know that it's needed at some point down the road, but they're not thinking about, or maybe they are thinking about it, but they just accept it. There's so much risk with it just sitting out there, not being used 99.99% of the time. And not just the fact that it's out there and it's got entitlements that allow it to go do things, but many times these identities become parts of that attack path that I told you about in these CNAPPs and these CSPM solutions. And fixing it is very, very daunting.
But let's say an organization did, and they were like, all right, we're just going to bite the bullet. We're going to do this hard work, clean it all up. I mean, is their problem solved?
No. Here's why. So we've got this slide here that for folks to take a look at. But I think that so we've got a customer that we work with here, big fintech company that you've heard of. Last year they used our CIEM tool, which was focused on identity risk. They used it to tackle 2,000 identities that were unused that we had exposed. Okay. How long did it take them to do that? 10 months.
Oh my goodness. That's so long.
And
think about all the risk during that time.
And the team of folks and the man hours. Okay.
Yeah.
But here's the problem, Stephen. What happened at the day one after the 10-month period? The problem had remanifested.
Yeah.
And it just never ends, and it never ends. So your question about is it one and done? Absolutely not. Not only is it one and done, but even if you were to delete all those identities, what about all of the over-permissioned identities that are living and breathing out there that you are facing getting to least privilege? You may have your least privilege recommended policy from your CNAPP CSPM of choice, but you've still got to go push that least privilege policy out there to those individual identities. But what about tomorrow or next week when a handful of those need updating because they suddenly do need a permission? They're going to get denied. They're not going to know why. They're going to open up ServiceNow tickets, et cetera, and it hurts the business, right? It hurts those app teams because they don't know why they can't get the permission they need, and it's a very manual process. So I think the takeaway is even if you were to do this by hand, you got to keep doing it over and over. This is not a one and done thing. This is a daily part for maintenance and governance for least privilege, because the cloud is changing as far as which permissions these person and non-person identities actually need, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, I think we have to remember one of the reasons that we went to the cloud is that it gives us the ability to move quickly, right? It gives us the ability to try something out, spin it up, tear it down if we need to, right? And have dynamic resources. If we, as security professionals, try to advocate for, okay, well, we can't manage that risk, so you're going to have to master plan this and tell me all the permissions, and it's going to take 3 months to get, a change into production. We've just completely shut down the business value, right, that we were trying to get.
Yeah. And so
is there a middle ground? I mean, like, how do we approach this? We can't just let it be a complete free,
No, there's things that we can do from a strategy perspective to actually take bites out of this risk. Okay. But it fundamentally, it has got to shift. We have to change the way that we, as a market, as cloud security practitioners, think about least privilege and the public cloud. Okay. Yeah. If you think about a hub and a spoke model, I use this analogy all the time with folks. Right now, the current tooling on the market is showing you that you have to go fix all of the spokes. Mm-hmm. Okay. Those are all the individual identities and workloads that are living and breathing in the platform itself. What we need to do is shift our mindset to fixing the hub itself. Because when you secure the hub, everything attached to it is affected. And if you do it in a way that's very safe, if you will, it gets you the least privilege. It gets you the promised land quickly, but in a way that you don't put your job in jeopardy because you just broke a bunch of stuff. Right. Yeah. And I think, you look at this slide here, the very first thing that it mentions is going from a role-based access control mechanism to an attribute-based access control mechanism. The problem with role-based is that we've seen it. Role proliferation is out there. 49,000 unused identities. The vast majority of them are roles in that customer environment. Mm-hmm. Right? And what's happening tomorrow? More roles, more roles, more roles. So I think one idea that we have is shifting. What if we just focus on the identities that we need and focus on attributes on those that dictate what they can do and where they can and cannot go, right? Mm-hmm. That is starting to shift things from a hub and spoke perspective back into the hub with that second thing that you see there, centralized policies, right? And instead of pushing out thousands and thousands of least privileged policies, what if there was a way that we could centralize it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
well, and so I would say I'm a pretty big fan of just-in-time access, mm-hmm. right? I really like the idea that we can create least privilege when we need it and revoke it later. And so I've been working with a number of customers to try to do this. One of the challenges that we run into is that it takes a lot of setup. Right? Like that is a long journey of getting the workflows in place and transitioning people without totally blocking what they're doing. How have you seen that go? I mean, how do you approach that kind of challenge?
Just in time's great. It is great. And most folks that I talk to and that work with that have any level of maturity with securing their public cloud are indeed using just-in-time. Mm-hmm. Where it starts to get shaky is when you move away from the people, right? You said people when you just talked about it. You use that word. That word is key. Just in time works great for people. The vast majority of what we see from a artifact standpoint that's out there or an unused standpoint is non-people, non-person identities, non-human identities. The market's kind of exploding now with non-human identity visibility tools. Okay. Mm-hmm. And it's because just-in-time is not sufficient when it comes to machine accounts, access keys, tokens, instance profiles, roles, service principals, service accounts, the list goes on, depending on your cloud service provider. But those are the non-human identities that folks assume in as well as machine identities assume in as to go do their day-to-day. So just-in-time does a fantastic job for people access, but that's really, really not the full picture. That is a fraction of the picture. It is a piece of the puzzle, but folks have got to realize that the world of non-human identities is equally, if not more risky, but it's certainly more prevalent when you're looking at the percentages of the unused makeup of the identities that we have sitting out here in our public cloud workload environments. And, I mentioned Access Analyzer here, right? It's kind of takes us back and it ties us back into the CSPM story, the CNAPP story, where you can try and do this by hand. There's plenty of tools out there that are going to recommend your least privilege policy. They're going to recommend that you've got all these unused identities because they've got least privilege analytics built into, their kitchen sink of use cases that the CNAPP or the CSPM does. But it's still a manual process, and it's hard to sustain that from a least privilege standpoint.
Yeah, I don't know about you. I'm not seeing much adoption of that. Even though we're all kind of aware that it's there, I'm not seeing that most customers are able to actually understand what they got out of that and then go back and apply it, right? Especially if you, I don't know, if you built something 30 days ago, you've already forgotten what you were trying to do. So now somebody coming in and telling me okay, change your policy to this. It's that's a project I've already forgotten about. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that's kind of a symptom of what we see in mass in the market right now, is that folks do have visibility into this problem, regardless of your tool. But at the end of the day, they're not actually able to take action on it. And they just kind of walk away, right? And it's interesting because we work with people, big organizations over the years here, big companies, Fortune 100, where we have satisfied a requirement for them for a compliance requirement where they have to be accounting for least privilege in their public cloud. I don't know of any compliance standard out there now at this point, CCM, CSA, CIS, PCI, the list goes on, that doesn't say that you must be accounting for least privilege in your public cloud environment. But what's happening is the vast majority of these organizations are saying that they're accounting for that risk because they have a CNAPP or a CSPM or a native tool. But what they're not actually doing is able to prove to the auditor that they're reducing the risk. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's where, tooling comes into play. So, there's ways that we can attempt to reduce the risk through custom tooling, which it is possible if you want to try and write scripts and little bots and use ChatGPT to help you out to try and tackle this. I would say it's technically possible, but it is going to be a long journey.
I don't recommend it. I've been there plenty. I don't recommend it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you. We presented at Reinforce this year in Philadelphia, and we presented on stage right before Meta presented. And I'm sure you know who Meta is, Facebook. And when we presented, we came off stage, and their presenter said to our CTO who was presenting, "Great presentation, love what you guys have built. We built it ourselves.
Yeah.
Don't recommend anyone else try it. If anyone asks me how we did it, I'm just going to recommend them to you." Okay, so trying to build it in-house would be daunting. And then you try and use some of these cloud services, and they all kind of have their own, whether it's GCP Policy Analyzer or Entra ID or, IAM Access Analyzer. There's some primitive native tooling that's out there that will give you some basic visibility into the problem, right? But you've still got to go remediate by hand. But what we're now seeing is kind of the birth and the evolution of custom-built tooling that is purpose-built to kind of tackle this, like you were talking about just in time. Just in time is perfect to tackle the problem. We have a ton of human identities that are sitting out there. We want to just strip all that away and grant people access when they need it and then revoke it and claw it back so that, none of that's sitting out there sitting all the time, right? And then we're seeing, we're super excited about the Cloud Permissions Firewall here at Sunry that we released earlier this year that's really designed to come in and fix this unused mess at scale in the public cloud very, very quickly and very, very safely.
So, okay, it's a permissions firewall. I mean, what is that, right? I mean, we hear about firewalls as a network concept. right?
Yeah.
I don't understand what that means as a permissions concept.
Yeah, so here, let me just take a second here, and I will show you. Let me log into my demo system and share my screen. Sure. I think it's easy, and this isn't, I'm not going to do a big demo pitch, but I'll show people what we're talking about.
I'm interested to see, because I want to be able to visualize it, right? Like my understanding, and you can correct me here, is that, you know, we're seeing this new analogy of permissions being the path, right?
Yeah.
So as network engineers, we used to think about those paths and what we would allow, you know, to pass. So how does that work with permissions?
Yeah, so you've got to think about, and this is the Sunring Cloud Permissions Firewall. It looks like a firewall, and it is acting like a firewall across the access fabric in the public cloud. There's nothing like its kind out of the market today. It's really a neat solution that we have now. And what you have to do, Stephen, is we talk about those 14,000 permissions in AWS. Think about in a next-gen firewall, when you're creating permits and deny rules, you're trying to create permits and deny rules on multiple protocols, but TCP, you've got 65,000 ports. Same thing in the public cloud. Public cloud, you've got almost 50,000 permissions, 14,000 of those in AWS, okay? You've got to think about the permits and denies in those permissions. The permits and denies in the cloud-native world are inside the JSON, inside IAM. And that's how you got to think about it, right? And when you think about it that way, securing the access fabric itself, it changes everything from your perspective for least privilege. It flips it on its head because we're not focusing on the spokes. We can come in and secure the hub. So what the Cloud Permissions Firewall does is it comes in and it adds a layer of orchestration into your public cloud environment using cloud-native controls that's really focused on exposing and then remediating that unused permissions attack surface that we've been talking about. You know, I'm not going to do a full demo here, but I do want to show it to you, right? We've got 4 primary areas of risk that make up the access fabric in the public cloud, right? We've been talking about this number 14 here, which represents unused permissions on active identities, right? How to get these identities to least privilege because they're over permissioned. Okay, what the firewall does is one click of a button here, it goes and restricts these identities and gets them to least privilege, but it does it in a way that is safely. It doesn't.
Okay, so it's not deleting it?
No, it's not taking away the entitlement. It is not.
What if that tried to run, right? Somebody tried to use that.
Well, these right here, that workflow, that flow is not. So that, like, let's just pick on EC2. EC2 has got 43 sensitive permissions inside it that the firewall is showing you is mapped to MITRE. Okay? Permissions like create NAT gateway, delete NAT gateway, things that can do harm to the business. When you protect those 14 identities, it tells the system that you can use non-sensitive permissions. And there's hundreds of non-sensitive permissions inside EC2. You can't use one of the dangerous ones. So it's getting it to least privilege in a way that matters from a dangerous permission standpoint. And if someone tries to use one of those permissions, like today, the way that you would do this today is you would take a least privilege policy recommendation, Stephen, and you would go manually apply it to that identity. And then if it was your account and you needed to create a NAT gateway, you would get denied.
That's right.
What then? What then? Ensue the wild goose chase of figuring out who and how to go get that permission for your identity. With the Cloud Permissions Firewall, we see that deny in real time. We're monitoring 24/7, and we route a notification to a pre-assigned approver in that application team or that organization to grant that permission back to you within a matter of seconds.
Oh, so you're going to get an alert with that. Because what I'm accustomed to is if I do revoke those permissions, I'm going to get an angry email. Or maybe something will just silently fail, right? And they won't be able to get their job done.
No, the beauty of this solution is that we do not break the business. We do not hinder the business. We actually help the business because we grant those permissions back that might be needed in real time, and you can do it temporarily. Like you can set a time box, and you do it all in Slack or in Teams. You don't even have to come back to the firewall. Most people that use this don't even know the firewall exists. They just know that there's this clever orchestration system that's doing all this in real time. You grant that permission back, And you're going to get a notification, by the way. You'll get a Slack saying, hey, Bob, the approver, granted you this permission for 2 hours. Go do your job. And it's go refresh the screen. You're good, right?
So this is like kind of flipping the just-in-time on its head, right? Like I'm going to get that access,
yep,
right after.
Well, and the fact is, a lot of environments we plug into and that we see are not greenfield; they are brownfield, and all this stuff is already out there.
Yeah.
So trying to implement just in time.
If I'm a big organization, I've got tons of accounts, tons of identities, whatever, like, and I'm looking at what was it like? Something like 10 months to go clean all of that up.
10 months to clean up 2,000. That was an actual customer story of ours. Yeah.
How quickly does it take for me to apply a firewall and get similar protection?
It takes us 5 minutes to deploy the role. It takes about a day to get the full analytics right here. And you can see all the services that are in your cloud, who's using what, how many unused identities you have, unused services, unused regions. And all you have to do is click the magic disable button on a region. You click the disable button on any of these services, and instantly, it is instant. You no longer have to write service control policies by hand, update them by hand constantly. You no longer have to research these 18 zombies. You don't have to research these 18 unused identities to determine whether or not you can delete them. Because what we do is we say, no, we don't have to delete anything. You click the quarantine button, and we're going to put these unused identities in identity jail.
Yeah.
And if they wake up, you're going to get a Teams message, a Slack message that says that zombie attempted to wake up. Maybe it is that one identity, Stephen, that you said you need once every 6 months. And that's fine. You grant it back and you put it right back in jail so that it can never be used accidentally or through a compromised credential nefariously against you. Or if it is attempted to be used nefariously against you, you're going to get a new indicator of compromise, Slack message or Teams message, because it tried to wake up, but we blocked it. So some cool capabilities there. But I think the takeaway is that when you look at these 4 use cases, what we're doing is we're coming straight at the pain point of attacking the problem that we've been talking about in the session today by hand. Because doing it by hand is almost impossible at scale, and it's static, it's inflexible, and you break things. And anyone that has worked with service control policies by hand knows the pain that I'm talking about. With this kind of solution here, it's really focused on removing that unused permissions attack surface. And again, when you click these buttons, you see those attack paths in your CSPM or your CNAPP, they vanish. It's really, really fascinating to see what happens there with the, with just removing those 4 components of unused parts of the cloud.
Because
right?
I mean, so, I love to see every report about real world cloud security incidents, right? And I got to say, like, I think they all have one of those things involved, right, in their path, right? So the most common thing we're seeing is some unprotected identity, right? So credentials get leaked somewhere, right? Or they just get compromised on the user's workstation, right? And then they're used lateral movement, right? They get used in an uncommon region, so maybe they don't set off alarms. Yeah. And as I see there, you're able to disable those regions.
Regions are huge.
Doing that.
It's interesting because people don't realize that when you turn on a new cloud environment, talking about AWS here, but in AWS, when you create a new account, you have access to all 350 services. They're all turned on by default because they want you to adopt and use the services, which is great. But it introduces a world of risk to the business of not just security risk, but cost implications as well, right? So you have to go in there and turn those off. And the only way to do that today is by hand, by custom writing JSON in service control policies. The same thing applies, Stephen, for regions. And when you create a new AWS environment, there's 17 on by default, 17 regions that are turned on by default.
Something we've worked with is we like to have both preventive and detective controls. So I can use a service control policy to try to block a region, but it's a pretty coarse-grained prevention, right? And then the detective control. What if you want to block it at very
specific scopes?
Yeah.
That's when it gets even more tricky.
But then if for some sort of detection, people tend to deploy like AWS Security Hub, right, with like config rules to look for misconfigured resources.
Yeah.
And you have to put one of those in every single region and pay for every single one of those every month, even if you don't intend to use that region.
Yeah, the cost implication. A lot of folks don't talk about that. Well, IAM Access Analyzer too. You got to pay for that just to get the visibility, right? So
it gets to be very difficult
something.
to advocate for, good security when the costs just really outweigh the obvious benefits.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, question for you. So I see your firewall there. How does this fit into my broader strategy? Because this isn't going to cover all of my CNAPP, needs, right? So how does this fit into a broader strategy?
Yeah, I think, and you see the slide now, right? You don't see the firewall anymore. Correct?
Yes. Yes.
Right. Just making sure. Yeah, so I think it needs to be a part of an end-to-end strategy. The first part is CNAPPs and CSPMs are great. And like I said, they have their work, their purpose, I think, and they do a great job with protecting workloads, visibility into workloads. A lot of times infrastructure as code and vulnerability scanning, and they do a great job with CSPM reports. But I think that you've got to have someone, you need to be thinking about, how am I actually going to take action on this? How am I going to actually be reducing this risk? And I think that for once now, folks can actually not just have reporting and being able to report and trend on them fixing this by hand, but now they have a tool that can prove that they're actually fixing it in big chunks, almost like a hammer, very, very quickly. So I think that it is all part of maturing your security strategy beyond we just need visibility, but we actually have to show the business that we're fixing this mess. Mm-hmm. So I think that, it's just another tool in your toolbox, but I don't think that it's a nice to have. I think it's a need to have at this point in time.
That's where I'm kind of landing these days, right? Is that like, we need to have a clear, not just strategy, but like we need to have clear results that we're accomplishing this least privilege, especially in a regulated environment. I mean, how can Sonarai like help me achieve different compliance requirements?
It's interesting because we can help you satisfy pretty much any compliance requirement that states, and they all do state this, by the way, that states you must have tooling custom built. A lot of it says third party, believe it or not, I've noticed now in the requirements, because they don't want you building it in-house. They require you to have third-party tooling that is not only accounting for, but helping you remediate so that you can prove that you're reducing risk as it relates to unused permissions and unused identities in the public cloud. We will absolutely help satisfy that requirement. You show that auditor what we are doing for you, and it is a no-brainer that you are good to go on that requirement for PCI or NIST or whatever that particular requirement might be, ensuring that those things are being adhered to. Not to mention, like you said, regions, GDPR, HIPAA, cross-geo data transfer. That right there is resonated really well with folks that we've been talking to, because they're like, whoa, you're telling me that this can assure that nothing gets cross-geo data transfer from a risk standpoint? And they're like, yeah, we didn't realize this is all turned on. We can just go in there and just turn it off, turn it off. I'm like, yeah, you just go turn it off. And that in itself helps with compliance, right? So there's a couple different use cases there.
That's a good point.
I think we're about 10 minutes left, so I did want to make sure and do a quick little spiel on folks are welcome to talk to us about trying the Cloud Permissions Firewall. You get the entire product for a free 2-week trial, where we can plug in with just a role in 5 minutes. We're onboarded, and we can give you the full lay of the land across the unused permissions attack surface across those 4 areas that I showed you, to just determine whether or not is there a problem. You don't even have to deploy any controls, but at least you can have some visibility for the first time into what this risk landscape looks like. So we would love to help you out. We do offer that 14-day trial.
Cool.
So how about we do some Q&A?
Let's do it.
Awesome.
Let me take a look in the box here. Let's see. Oh.
Yeah, I was just going to say that sounds like a plan. We do have a ton of questions in from our attendees, and I do want to take the time just to remind the audience, if you have any questions, please make sure to type those in now, and we'll get them answered. So the first question that I have that came in, this one reads, our problem with fixing things our CNAPP found is not time, but cooperation. We have many developer teams, and they're the ones that have to fix stuff. How are you getting around that?
Can I take a stab at it?
Yeah, go ahead. I mean, this is kind of at the core of all these challenges, right? Is balancing which teams do what. So how are you addressing that?
It reminds me, Stephen, it reminds me of like, and you and I have been in the game a while, okay? It reminds me of what we've been dealing with for 30 years almost of vulnerability scans, where you got your purpose-built tooling that's doing vulnerability scans, and what are you doing? You're sending out PDF reports to all the different team owners of those parts of the environment and those applications, and you're saying, you got to go fix this mess. It's not that unsimilar to dealing with a CNAPP when you think about it, because you're reporting on a bunch of problems and you're sending them out to those different teams to go fix. So I totally get, the frustration, the question. I think that I don't know if you recall that slide that we looked at earlier that had the grid on it, the table, but one of the things was shift left. Okay. And I think that that's key. Shift left is really overused these days, but I believe that fundamentally that we have got to move the area of responsibility down to the folks that are actually creating the problems themselves. Okay.
Yeah.
That's not easy.
That's where I'm at as well. So the way that I think about this is I need central visibility, right? I need to have my security team be able to understand how much risk we have exposed, right?
Yeah.
But they just cannot be the ones responsible and accountable for going and fixing all of those things. And so it has to be, especially in the cloud, it has to be the teams that understand those workloads. So I like to argue that they need to be accountable for their security.
The logistics, though, is where things fall apart. How do they get the information? How do they act on it timely? And I think that's fundamentally the problem that we have to fix as a market. Shameless plug on the firewall that I just showed you. That's why we route that risk to those teams themselves over Slack and Teams. That's how they like to communicate and operate anyways, is via Slack and Teams. We call it chat operations, but it allows them to actually make decisions in real time about whether or not they should be granting permissions to their developers on an ad hoc basis and in a way that doesn't really hinder the business. Not that you need to use the firewall and that's what you need to use, but that's the mindset that we need to be focused on, is how do we actually route those approvals to those teams so that they can actually, participate in securing the business.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing is, like, I can make the teams responsible for trying to do things securely. But ultimately there's some CISO, some CIO, whatever, who's going to be held accountable if they don't do it right. So we have to find the balance of like mitigating that risk. I like the way that the firewall balances that, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Awesome. The next question that we received reads, in my CNAPP world, identity is the third most important thing I'm working on right now. First is CVEs. Second is lethal C scanning. How can it be more important than a high CVE?
CVEs. Yeah, so I'm not going to say that securing identity is more important than CVE as a mindset. They both have to be done. They're both part of what I would call a well thought out and structured security strategy. But I will say this, a CVE is not how the vast majority of all the public cloud breaches that you've heard about these days happening. The vast majority of them, and I know Stephen will agree, they just
That's true. As security guys, we kind of like get excited at the idea that some, buffer overflow like caused, and it's like a very exciting technical exploit, right? But unfortunately, that's not how it is. Like most of the time, it's some sort of like phishing or something, right? Somebody clicked on something and they've got permissions.
It's interesting. I follow, I can't show right now, but I follow a GitHub repository. All they do is track AWS security incidents. And they've been tracking it for years. And it's interesting because they have the root cause of every one of them. 75%, Stephen, are password exposure, GitHub data exposure. Every one of them, they just log in. So CVEs matter, but I'm telling you, you want to protect your cloud, you secure the identity footprint. You have to.
Yeah, but even if the CVE, like, you know, there's some exploit on a public-facing resource, even if that happens to be the first initial access, it has a pretty limited amount of risk. Because let's say that's a EC2 instances, for example, or a compute instance. Can't reach the database without permissions.
Sometimes it can. Sometimes it can, but most often times it can't. And that's the blast radius. And if you don't have something showing you that context, then what's the point anyways? Because what are you going to go do? Fix 10,000 workloads that have that vulnerability? What if of the 10,000, what if only 5 of them have access to the crown jewels? How do you know that?
Yeah. So it's, even if CVEs are your top priority, I mean,
without the identity fabric, it's useless.
Yeah. It's still part of the chain.
Totally.
Awesome. We had another question come in from Rocky Ellis. This one reads, what cloud-native security challenges do we currently face that a CNAPP or Sunrise Security could address? Are there specific regulatory compliance requirements that Sunrise could help us meet in our cloud environments? And how does a Sunrise identity risk management compare with our current IAM solution? So quite a few questions there. Maybe just a brief sentence.
So I think that we kind of covered regulatory compliance requirements that we could help meet with Sunrise as it relates to actually showing that you are doing something about getting to least privilege in the cloud as it relates to the IAM fabric itself, right? That's I think that we established that. And how do we compare with your current IAM solution? Be careful with the word IAM. That's kind of all encompassing. That could get us into the world of, you know, federation and single sign-on and all this, right? We're really focused on platform risk across the identity fabric. And right now, there is a 99% likelihood that whatever tool that you currently have that focuses on what we're fixing here is just showing you risk. It's showing you 10,000 problems that you were staring at the end of the day. We're all about action and fixing those 10,000 problems for you quickly and safely. There really is nothing out there in the market, and I say that truthfully, that does what we do. We're kind of generating a whole new market here by flipping least privilege on in the cloud over on its head. So I wouldn't say there's anything that would really we compete with. We would complement and really enhance whatever you're already using as far as tooling goes.
Cool. Jeff, thanks so much for showing me how this works and letting me pick your brain.
My pleasure.
It's cool to see some innovation in this space, right? Like we're of the same mind about these challenges, and we got to fix it, right? Not just preach the same stuff and expect different results.
Yep. My pleasure. I really appreciate you guys having me.
Yeah, of course. Thanks so much. Of course, Stephen and Jeff for being on with us today. That is all the time we have for today. Thank you again for this great presentation, for that demo, and for answering all the questions in from our attendees. And of course, a special thank you to Sunrise Security for sponsoring today's event presented by AWSinsider.net. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone. And thank you again, Stephen and Jeff.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.